Oh, hey friends, my name is Shayda Campbell, and on this channel, we make art together. The first card that we're starting with today is a little mini poinsettia, and here's how we create it. We go around with a dark red and do 4 or 5 petals. Then you're gonna rinse your brush, come back in with the wateriest, lightest of reds, and we're gonna paint 5 more petals, kind of where those initial petals meet. You can start with some little yellow dotting in the center, or you can leave the center blank for now, and we'll do the stamen later. With that done, we're gonna grab a dark green. This is a mix of deep phthalo green and brown, and we are gonna frame those mini poinsettias with lots of little pointed leaves, and maybe a couple little stems and branches as well. Just run the belly of the brush across the paper, get a nice organic leaf shape, bring it to a little point using the tip of your round brush. And if you've started with a slightly watery green for those leaves, you can release a little darker pigment into the lightly wet area and get that watercolor magic. Friends, for anyone who's not just watching, if you're actually painting along with me, everything you need to know, supplies and colors, all the pigments I've used, are listed at the end of the video. You'll also find supply links in the video description, and if you'd like to shop my supplies on Amazon, it's a great way to support the channel and get the exact art supplies that you see me using. To complete the poinsettia, we're going to take a little red-brown and do a horizontal line for the top of the flower pot, then add a little water to the paint and kind of work out a rounded square right underneath, maybe leaving a little highlight. For now, we'll set that aside and let it dry, and we'll come back later and add some detail using a wet on dry technique. The idea with these cards today is that you've got a tiny little 4x6 piece of watercolor paper, and you're gonna leave a really large border. There's lots of negative space, kind of forcing your painting to look super sophisticated as it sits tiny and cute in the middle of that large piece of paper. And you can just paint what I'm painting, but you can also paint anything you can think of, anything that makes you feel like it's the holiday season, anything that gives you that cozy vibe. For me, it's definitely lots of berries and evergreen and poinsettias and pears. You could paint orange rounds and candles, or you could paint a little Rudolph face, anything that you can think of. Every little piece of watercolor paper is another chance to try something different. And if you screw up one, it's all good. You're just moving on to the next one. For this one, I kind of worked out the shape of a pear using yellow ochre, did a tiny stem and some green leaves. And then I just released a little bit of a darker yellow ochre mixed with a bit of brown into the wet area to help with the shading. And then just like the poinsettia, we're gonna set it aside and we'll come back in later and add some detail when we can be a bit more precise, when it's dry. Next up, how about a little Charlie Brown Christmas tree? We'll start with a red-brown on the tip of a small brush, and we're just working out like a rounded rectangle. Then give it its tiny little trunk, which is basically just a messy line, and then add some little branches, kind of wiggle your brush, shake your paintbrush a bit so that all of these branches are looking a little rough, a little ragged, very perfectly imperfect. Then we're gonna grab some dark green. This is deep phthalo green mixed with brown on the tip of our brush. Just need a little bit of pigment, and we're going to start doing these tiny, teeny tiny, messy little lines all along each of the branches, and maybe a few on the trunk as well. If they blur together and get a bit smudged, I think that's a good thing. Some should be very singular, but others a bit messy. That's going to give a nice sophisticated painterly look. And if you need to add a few extra branches at this point, you're kind of forming the tree so you know what looks good. Now that I've got all the thin needles painted, I'm just taking a slightly more watery green, doing some brush strokes, kind of to give it a bit of a fuller look. We don't want it too full. It is a little Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And then I'm using the brown again, and I'm just going to paint a little heart here, and we'll make it look like a little gingerbread cookie. But again, we'll come back later and work some detail magic once this has dried. The final thing here that I'm going to do is just take a slightly darker brown, and we'll add some shading and a kind of bark-like texture to the base of the tree. That went so well. Let's stick with this evergreen painting. I love painting pine and cedar at this time of year. Not only are they pretty, but they are great brushwork practice if you're getting started with watercolors, or if you're, a professional, you still want to get that practice in. So let's start with a curving, messy couple of branches right in the center of our paper, and then we'll grab that really dark green again. This is deep phthalo green mixed with a bit of brown, and just with the tip of a relatively small round brush, we're going to paint all these really thin, delicate lines. And they all kind of cluster together. If some get quite messy, that's okay, while others are perfectly thin and precise. Bit of both, a bit of mess and a bit of precise, I think looks good here. And then once that's done, I kind of did 3 stems that all meet. We're going to take a really light watery brown. This is a great way to paint little pine cones. And we'll paint 2 egg shapes just with the super watery brown. And then give them like a second to dry, and then using a darker brown, put a few little dots of pigment on there. The color will seep out beautifully, and you've given it the look of a pine cone. Again, we'll add more detail later on when this is dry. How about painting some rose hips? This is the beautiful fruit of the rose bush, and it remains on the plant, on the branches, long after all the leaves have gone. So if you're out on a winter walk, you'll often see these bright red berries. They sort of dry on the bush. They're oval and quite large. So I'm painting some sort of orangey red ovals, leaving a little bit of a highlight. I've done a cluster of 3, but you can do as many as you want. And then when they're still wet, you want to take a little brown on the tip of your brush, and we're going to work right at the top of each berry or each rose hip and just paint these thin little brown lines. Make them a little bit scraggly and weird and messy. We'll add a little bit of darker red into that wet area just at the base to create some shading. And then I'm taking a nice warm green. This is like a green-gray, maybe even mixed with a little bit of red in there. And we're going to join them with a stem and some branches, and we'll run that belly of the brush across the paper, get some nice natural leaf shapes. Use the tip of the brush to refine, put a little point on some of those leaves. And that is our rose hip. We'll add detail later using a wet on dry technique. You guessed it. Moving on, let's paint cedar. We did some pine and our little pine tree. Well, cedar is like the lace of the forest. And so I love painting it. It's kind of like a fern. We can start with a thin curving line to mark center. And then we're going to do these little messy dotting, these little tiny lacy brush strokes. And as we go down that stem, we're going to allow these little branches to get larger and larger, still wiggling the brush, just dotting. The brush is sort of just barely hitting the page. The pigment just drops on, and we form this beautiful lacy like cedar. You'll also notice I'm grabbing from different colors of green. I've got some different greens sitting on the palette. So one little section might be quite light, a little bit of sap green mixed in, and the next much darker with that deep phthalo green. And that gives a very lively look to the plant. And then as we work our way down, we'll grab a little bit of Van Dyke brown and add the darker stem at the very center. Finally, how about a sweet little winter bird? No idea what kind of bird this is. It's a winter bird though. I'm going to start with a circle using a blend of white with just a hint of brown, so it's a very, very light beige. And then while that is still wet, rinse your brush, pick up a little Van Dyke brown, and we're going to just lightly crest the top of that circle, doing some long, thin lines, and that is forming the wing. Maybe even get a darker brown for the bottom of the wing, a few thin lines, and then work out the shape of the head at the top there. Make sure to keep the head of the bird quite small. And you can see because the pigment is wet, it all blends really beautifully. And I'm even taking a light brown and adding a few little lines to make the look of feathers on his belly. Then using a very, very watery brown, we're just working out the shape of the tail, just using some thin swooping brush strokes. And finally, he gets 2 little legs and feet. Quite a simple bird, and it comes together really quickly. This is one that I kind of go back to again and again when I'm practicing because I'm not super proficient with birds. It's a nice way to approach it. You can add a little bit of a branch there if you want, using a nice warm brown, something like red brown, and just use kind of, again, like a little wobble of the brush so that the branch looks very perfectly imperfect and rough. And then finally, I took some black, added a small beak and a little eye. I'm also using my small round brush, this is a number 3, I believe, to just do a little bit of coloring on the bird. So some very thin little dots and lines gives a nice look and helps him appear that he has a more natural coloring. You guessed it, we're gonna set it aside, let it dry. And we've got all these beautiful little mini illustrations, perfect for the holidays, perfect for sending out in the mail. I always start with just a bit of watercolor paper, and then I just glue the paintings onto blank cards that I get at the dollar store. And so what I want to do now, I've got my 7 little pieces of paper here, my 7 paintings. We're just going to work a little wet on dry magic. This is just what it sounds like. Wet on dry means adding wet paint on top of the dry paint or dry paper, and it allows you to be wonderfully precise. That paint is not going to move and blend the way it did when we put it onto wet pigment. So we can add a little bit of shading, maybe some more dotting on our pine cones, a few thin lines on the poinsettia petals, a little bit of shading on the rose hips, just on the bottom left, and maybe a splotch of darker green on some of the leaves, or you could do some veining lines. These tiny little details really add a lot to the paintings, and they're simple and fun to do. And that's not all. We're also going to grab a white gel pen and add just a little detail to our gingerbread cookie, add the icing, and maybe a little highlight on the bird's eye. We'll finish our cards by writing our holiday greetings, Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays or whatever you want to write. Try to keep those greetings centered. Do them in pencil first, go over it in pen, and then erase your pencil. Here are my finished cards. I just love these mini paintings. Hopefully I'll actually mail some this year. Mine always get made, they don't always get mailed. Stick around for supplies and pigments, but first, if you love this content, hit that subscribe button and help me get to 1 million. I am so close. Okay, our supplies today. We used hot pressed paper cut into little 4x6 pieces, but you're certainly welcome to use cold pressed or rough. Just make sure that it's 140 pound at least so that it doesn't buckle and warp when you're painting. You'll also need a small round paintbrush. I recommend like a number 4. A set of watercolor paints, 2 glasses of clean water, and some paper towel for blotting your brush. To finish the cards, we used a white gel pen, fine liner, and pencil. Check the description for all the supply links. And the pigments that I used today are deep phthalo green, gray green, sap green, Van Dyke brown, red brown, cadmium red, yellow ochre, white, and black. Thanks for watching, friends. See you soon.